With the festive season being a little gloomy for a lot of us this year, I wanted to put everything aside for a while and talk about a Christmas film that has become traditional viewing to most, if not all of us. It's a film, I think, that everyone's familiar with, even if it's not considered a favourite. I must admit it's no longer a favourite of mine, even though I still have a fondness for it, and I still consider it a beautiful piece of nostalgia.
Santa Claus the movie was released in 1985. It was produced by Ilya Salkind, part of the famous Salkind production team behind the Chris Reeves Superman films. It tells a sort of origin story of Santa Claus, but it's not really to be taken that seriously. It's more of a fantasy representation of the origin story of Santa Claus.
The film stars David Huddleston as Santa Claus. Fans of a certain genre will recognise David Huddleston as the Big Lebowski. One of my favourite comedy performers, Dudley Moore, stars as an elf called Patch. Most of the film is actually about Patch, but I'll come to this later. Santa's wife, Anya, is played by Judy Cornwell, and if you're a fan of the sitcom Keeping Up Appearances, as I am, then you'll recognise Judy as Hyacinth's sister, Daisy. In my opinion, the best character by far is BZ, played with the usual gusto by John Lithgow. Every scene with Lithgow in is just golden, and you can tell he's enjoying every moment. BZ is basically the Scrooge of the story. He's this corrupt toy manufacturer who doesn't understand what Christmas is supposed to be about, etc. I just love the moments when he raises his voice in that over-the-top manic way that only Lithgow can do to perfection.
American favourite Burgess Meredith also makes a small appearance as a wise old elf known as the Ancient One. The story is actually told very well, at least at first. It starts off somewhere in the 1300s and progresses to the present day. Well, the present day being the 80s, but you know what I mean. It's unclear exactly where the film takes place to begin with, but by the look of it, I would say it's set somewhere in the Nordic region. It looks like it's straight out of Frozen. In fact, there's even a little girl called Elsa. The rest of the film is set in New York City, well, apart from Santa's workshop, which I'll come back to later. The film begins with a 14th century village awaiting the arrival of Claus, a woodcarver who delivers toys to everyone at Christmas time along with his wife Anya. On their way to another village, Claus and Anya and their two reindeer, Donna and Blitzen, are caught in a blizzard and fall into a sleep. It's implied that quite a bit of time passes before they wake up. They wake to find themselves at the North Pole, where a group of elves save them and bring them to a magical workshop. Claus is told that he and Anya will now live forever, and that it's his destiny to deliver toys to all the children of the world every Christmas Eve.
There are many YouTube critics who have said that Claus effectively becomes a slave to the elves and is given no choice about this new life, and yeah, I must admit, I always did have this thought watching it, even when I was a kid. I mean, how would you feel if you were suddenly taken away against your will and told that you were going to deliver gifts every year for all eternity? I mean, I'd be pretty pissed off by that. They don't even ask him, they just sort of tell him how he's going to be living his life from now on.
Anyway, Claus meets with a wise old elf known as the Ancient One, who tells him that he is now known as Santa Claus. It's actually implied here that Claus and Anya weren't able to have children of their own for whatever reason, which is why it was prophesied that he would become Santa Claus. Santa is given his trademark red and white outfit and additional reindeer that can fly when fed a magical ingredient. Now, this magical ingredient isn't really explained in the film, but it seems to be used by the elves quite a bit. The centuries pass and Santa Claus becomes the symbol of Christmas we've all come to know. It's when the story gets to the 20th century that things start to get interesting.
This is where the film starts to focus more on Patch as the main character. As mentioned, Patch is played by Dudley Moore, and whilst there's nothing wrong with his performance in general, I tend to think his comedy talent is a bit wasted in this film. What I mean is, there doesn't seem to be many opportunities for him to be funny. He does have moments where he might make you chuckle, but most of the time he just plays it seriously. It is a good performance though.
Patch competes with another elf called Puffy to become Santa's new assistant. Patch, being a somewhat eccentric inventor, builds a machine that assembles toys from wooden parts. Patch becomes the new assistant, not realising that something went wrong with the machine and his toys are faulty. When Santa's workshop starts getting returns, Patch decides to spare Santa the agony of demoting him and gives up his position to Puffy. The scene that follows is incredibly emotional.
Patch decides to leave the North Pole in a bid to prove himself to Santa, but first he says goodbye to the reindeer. The moment where Patch hugs Donna and a tear rolls down his eye is just so heartbreaking. It always wells me up.
Patch heads for New York, and this is where we're introduced to BZ, a ruthless and cold-hearted toy manufacturer. As mentioned earlier, this character is played very over the top and isn't meant to be taken seriously. BZ's business is going under because it's discovered his products are dangerous and unsafe for children. There's a clever scene where Patch watches the BZ toys being withdrawn from displays, but he mistakes them for being top sellers. Patch, believing BZ to be a successful toy maker, goes to him and asks to make something for his company in a bid to prove his worth to Santa Claus. BZ simply sees it as an opportunity to make more money and reclaim his reputation.
Meanwhile, Santa befriends a young homeless boy called Joe. This is really the only other storyline that Santa has in the film. Santa basically takes Joe under his wing and the two form a father-son bond. There's a scene where Santa and Joe are flying around New York City and they try to get the reindeer to do something called a super duper looper. This becomes important later. Well, sort of.
There's a weird tie-in when Joe meets a young girl called Cornelia, who just so happens to be BZ's step-niece, if there is such a thing. Anyway, Patch invents a magical lollipop that can make people walk on air.
Patch also invents this really awesome vehicle known as the Patchmobile, which he uses to deliver the lollipop. It's basically a flying car that's fueled by the magical ingredient, and what can I say? When I was a kid, I wanted one of these things.
The lollipop becomes a big hit and Patch becomes something of a celebrity, along with BZ, who pockets all of the money. But when Santa sees how successful Patch and BZ are becoming, he starts to sink into a depression and even considers giving up on Christmas. When Patch tells BZ that he wants to go home to the North Pole, BZ refuses to let him go and asks him to make something else. Now Patch, unaware that he is effectively now a prisoner, reluctantly agrees to make huge batches of candy canes that can make people fly. However, it turns out that the secret magical ingredient has a small flaw that not even Patch is aware of.
One night, BZ's assistant Towser comes to see him with some urgent news. I actually quite like the character of Towser. He reminds me so much of Rick Moranis from Ghostbusters. The characters are very similar. He's anxious all the time and he's never quite sure what he's supposed to be doing.
Towser informs BZ that, unbeknown to Patch, a batch of candy canes exploded and destroyed one of their laboratories. It turns out that the secret ingredient Patch has been using needs to be kept at cold temperatures, and if it gets too hot, it becomes explosive.
BZ tells Towser not to tell anyone, not even Patch, about the incident. It's here we see that BZ is more than just a money-making crook. He actually doesn't care about potentially killing innocent people and even children. This is actually quite evil and twisted, even for a family Christmas film. It does, however, lead to my all-time favourite line from BZ.
This stuff can kill people. Are you going soft on me?
We're talking about killing innocent children, and he asks Towser if he's going soft on him? This guy should be a Bond villain.
To make things worse, Joe, who is unwell with a cold, is staying with Cornelia, and the two of them overhear BZ and Towser talking about the candy canes.
I have to say at this point, Joe deserves an award for the world's most convincing fake sneeze.
Joe gets caught and locked up in a basement while Cornelia contacts Santa for help. Meanwhile, Patch, still unaware of what's been going on, finds Joe in the basement and, upon realising that Santa still needs him, decides to take Joe back to the North Pole with him. They both load the Patchmobile with candy canes, unaware that they've already begun to ignite. BZ, in the meantime, is tracked down by the police for his evil scheme, but he scoffs his face with candy canes before they can get to him, and he leaps out of the window, but not before giving us what I think is one of the best maniacal laughs. But unfortunately, it seems that there may be too much formula in the candy canes and BZ just rises higher and higher into the air, unable to stop. Cornelia and Santa chase the Patchmobile over the icecapes of the North Pole. It does actually get quite intense at this point. Well, except for one thing.
When the candy canes explode, the Patchmobile is destroyed and Patch and Joe are catapulted into the air, but it seems that Santa has an idea.
The super duper looper! It's the only way!
The reindeer successfully perform the super duper looper and swoop underneath Patch and Joe just in time to catch them.
But why was this the only way to catch them? Why couldn't they just catch them without doing the loop? Even as a kid, this didn't make any sense to me.
Anyway, Patch returns to his friends at the North Pole, Santa and Anya adopt Joe as their own, and BZ joins the Superman school of how to survive in space without wearing a spacesuit. The way the film looks is sort of a mixed bag. It sort of shifts between two worlds, Santa's workshop and the modern-day New York City, and both would obviously look quite different. The design of Santa's workshop is very grand and does have that Santa's grotto feel to it. As mentioned earlier, it looks very Nordic, like it's come straight out of Disney's Frozen. You expect that big summer blowout guy to make an appearance at any moment. The scenes set in New York are okay, but nothing really that special. In fact, we don't really see that much of New York, except in the scenes where Santa is flying above, which are actually done very well for the time.
The costumes for me are a bit of a letdown, particularly the way they dress at the North Pole. I personally don't like these rag doll-like outfits, and the colours are a bit pastel-y. It's just not how I would imagine it. Santa's outfit is fine, but it's a bit plain and it doesn't really have that much to it. I mean, I just feel like a little more imagination and creativity could have gone into the outfits.
The effects for the time are actually quite good. As mentioned, the flying scenes over New York City and the North Pole are very well done, and the animatronic reindeer are very realistic. The editing used for the vanishing effects were carried out quite well, especially during the scene where Patch is showing off to BZ in his office. It's very clean. The casting of the film is actually quite interesting. Dudley Moore was apparently a first choice to play Patch. He's great in the role, but as I said before, I just wish there was more comedy from him.
David Huddleston does a good enough job. It's just a shame that the film doesn't really focus on him that much. There are moments when he is really convincing as Santa Claus though. For example, there's a beautiful scene where he gives a present to a little girl and his face just looks so kind and loving, and he has this twinkle in his eye. It's exactly how one would imagine Santa to look.
Undoubtedly, it's John Lithgow who steals the show. His acting is so over the top, but he is just so much fun to watch. Yeah, he's twisted and corrupt, but he never really comes across as truly menacing, despite the fact that he's willing to kill kids in order to make money. He's a comic book villain, like Lex Luthor or the Joker. I describe them as evil but silly. I mean, come on, how the hell can you take this guy seriously?
For real?
Despite being a failure at the box office and a disappointment to critics, Santa Claus the movie has since become a cult classic and a Christmas favourite, particularly over here in England. As mentioned, it's not really a favourite film of mine anymore. Well, not that it ever really was, but I still do appreciate it for what it tries to do. It's a guilty pleasure for me, and I think that's where it sits for most of us. It does do a fine job of spreading the message of Christmas. It reminds us that when things get depressing, we shouldn't just give up. When times are down, we need to realise our own value and self-worth. Christmas is going to be difficult for a lot of us this year, as it is for a lot of people every year, but let's all try to remember what Christmas is truly about. It's about hope. Stay safe, everyone, and Happy Christmas.